I'm going to tell you about some of my spring vegetable garden fails from this year. Now, I've been a container vegetable gardener for 7 years now, but every year I still have some things that just don't go well. And that's just how vegetable gardening is. If anyone tries to tell you differently, they're not being truthful with you. The truth is that every growing season is different from the last. The weather patterns are different, the amount of rain you get is different, the time you plant is probably going to be a little different. And you're also, as a gardener, going to be trying new things. You might plant something in a different container or in a different area than you planted it previously. You might be trying different fertilizers. There's just so many different factors that can change. And so what that means is that sometimes things work out and sometimes they just don't. And so when I get to the end of each growing season, whether it's spring, summer, or fall, I like to reflect on the previous season to see kind of what went well and what didn't. And so today I'm going to share with you what didn't go so great with me this spring in my garden. We're going to start with this container here. So I currently have a lot of my summer warm season vegetable plants in it. I have summer squash, tomatoes, eggplants, and herbs. So these are all more of those warm season vegetables, but I still have a lot of my carrots growing. Carrots are spring cool season vegetables, and usually you harvest them around the time when you're getting those warm season vegetables in. Now, carrots do always take a lot longer than you think they will. So there's also a piece of patience to it. But about halfway through the growing season, I realized that I had made a mistake when I was planting this container out. So when I first planted everything on March 2nd, I started it all from seed and the sun was hitting the whole container beautifully. I thought this is going to be great. I had amended my soil, added some fertilizer. And so I had planted mustard spinach in the middle. I had regular spinach, arugula, and then all the carrots. And so when they were all small seedlings and growing, everything was looking really great. Well, as the spring went on and the plants got taller, and let me tell you, my mustard spinach grew really well. It got pretty tall. What I realized was that the angle that the sun was shining on this bed meant that the sun was coming from this direction. And so it was first hitting the plants at the front, and then the middle, and then the back. And with the mustard spinach growing so tall, what that meant was for most of the spring, my carrots were totally getting shaded out. And so I realized that they weren't getting a lot of sunlight, and carrots are something that need a good amount of sunlight to grow. And so I had a feeling that I was not going to have a great carrot harvest. Now, these carrots are still growing and they are kind of partially shaded here on my back deck. So I'm leaving them in. I'm probably going to leave them in maybe for another week and then I'll harvest them. And hopefully that extra added time that I'm giving them will help them produce a little bit better. But I just know for sure that these are not going to be great carrot harvests, especially compared to previous seasons when I've given them a lot more sunlight. And so how I will change that for next year, if I do something similar with this container, I will put the plants that need more sunlight at the front. And then things like that mustard spinach and the arugula, those can grow really well in full shade or partial shade. And so I'll put those more towards the back. So that was a lesson learned. Another thing in this container that didn't go well for me is that regular variety of spinach that I planted. This was my second year growing that spinach from seed, and it bolted really early on in the spring. It did the same thing to me last year when I had it in a different location. And so whatever I'm doing wrong, that spinach just for some reason isn't growing well for me. And so I'm just not going to grow that variety again. My mustard spinach did amazingly. My arugula also did really, really well. And so next year, instead of that variety of spinach, I'm going to try a different one and see if it grows better. And that's the great thing about gardening is you have a different season every year. Or in the case of the cool season vegetables, you have spring and fall. And so actually this fall, I will do that mustard spinach again because it was really great, but I will try a different variety of spinach or other leafy green that will hopefully do a lot better. Other fails that I had this year were my beets and my radishes. So kind of similar to the other container, when I first planted these from seed, they were planted in a container that was getting a good amount of sunlight because all the plants were smaller. But once the leafy greens around them grew taller, I mostly had kale and Swiss chard, it totally shaded out those root vegetables. And I should have known better. I've been gardening long enough that I know that these root vegetables need a good amount of sunlight to really properly bulb up and get a good harvest from. And so I knew again, kind of early on in the spring, once I saw how shaded they were throughout the day, that they just weren't going to do great. Now, the radishes, I was able to get a few good radishes out of this harvest. So those were good. I had them on salads, but the beets never really bulbed up. Now, the good thing about beets is that the leafy greens, the tops of them are really wonderful. And so I added those to salads, but I was disappointed I didn't get any beetroot this year. And so, again, one tweak for my next cool season growing is that I will make sure that those root vegetables are planted somewhere where they are getting enough sunlight to be able to grow well. My last point isn't really a fail, but it's just something that I wish I would have done a little differently. And that is the timing of when I planted out a lot of my spring vegetables. So I started this container, like I said, on March 2nd. I put everything in from seed. And during the early spring, it does get pretty cold. The weather can be very temperamental here in the Midwest. Sometimes it gets really cold, sometimes it gets really hot. And so, what I'll do in the early spring is I will use a frost cover over my containers to be able to keep the temperature a little warmer and extend my growing season. And so I planted everything from March 2nd, which is pretty early compared to what is usually recommended. Usually, like mid March is more when you want to start planting some of your seeds outside. Sorry, I got distracted. There was a bee, but that's great. We love bees. So come back. Um, I planted it out pretty early into the frost cover, but this was the only container where I did that. And I had, other than the carrot issue, this container did really well. That mustard spinach and the arugula grew wonderfully. And so the other containers here and in my raised beds, I waited until mid to late March to start planting. And I just really wish that I would have planted everything in early March because as I got to the end of spring and early summer, when I'm starting to get some of those warmer vegetables in, I was still waiting for a lot of my spring vegetables to finish up and finish harvesting. And so I could plant those warm season vegetables. And I just think that if I would have started everything a couple weeks earlier, I could have wrapped up some of those plants sooner. For example, right now I still have some of my snap peas that are growing because there's a few pods that I'm just waiting for them to fill out and harvest before I completely get rid of that plant for the season. But what that means is it's taking up a space where I could be growing cucumbers or green beans, which are those summer warm season trellis vegetables that I like to grow. And so it's just a matter of getting things in at the right time. When you're a small space container vegetable gardener like me, I take up every inch of space. And so every growing season, everything is full, which means I have to harvest it all before I can plant the next season's vegetables. And so getting started a little bit earlier, I think would have been beneficial. And so next year, I will start earlier in March, again, using those frost covers. So those are my spring garden fails from this year. But like I said, I had so many more other spring garden vegetable plants that were a total success. I had great harvest. And so overall, really happy with how the season went. But every year is an opportunity to learn, and I will be able to take these lessons into the fall growing season and make sure that I don't make some of these mistakes again. I hope you found this helpful and that you have a great growing season.